You were told that you were made in the image of God. You were told that you were shaped by loving hands and set down inside a garden, a place of cool rivers and heavy fruit, and that your only task was to tend the green and walk with the divine in the breeze of the evening. That is the story almost every person alive grew up with. It is gentle, it is beautiful, and there is a slab of baked clay, older than the oldest surviving page of any Bible on this planet, that tells the very same story with one thing taken away and one thing added, and those two small changes turn the entire meaning inside out. Because this tablet does not say that you were made for a garden. This tablet says that you were built the way a tool is built for a reason. And the reason is the part that nobody wants carved over the door of a church. So stay with me, because by the time we are done, you are going to understand why the oldest creation story humanity has ever pulled out of the ground does not end in Eden, and what it says you were actually made to do. Let me show you the object first, because on this channel we start with the thing in the dirt, not with the legend. What we are talking about is a story the scholars call the Atrahasis. It was pressed into wet clay with a sharpened reed in the cities of ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the two great rivers that we now call Iraq. The most complete copy we have was written down in the old Babylonian period, almost 4,000 years ago, by a scribe who actually signed his work at the bottom the way a craftsman signs a chair. That is older than King David. That is older than Moses by any date you choose. It is, by a wide margin, older than the Hebrew text of Genesis as we have it, and the creation story inside it is older still, because the Babylonians who copied it were already retelling something the Sumerians before them had been telling for centuries. This is one of the oldest written answers to the oldest human question: where did we come from, and why are we here? For a long time, the world had no idea this answer existed, because the tablets lay broken and scattered under the ruins of collapsed palaces. The man who first cracked them open was a self-taught Englishman in the 1800s, a former banknote engraver who learned the wedge writing by staring at broken tablets in the back rooms of a museum until the marks began to make sense. When he realized that one of the fragments in front of him was telling a flood story that matched the book of Genesis, the account goes that he leapt up and started tearing off his clothes in his excitement, and the study of the Bible has never been the same since. Patient scholars after him spent generations fitting the broken pieces back together like a shattered plate, until at last they could read this one almost from beginning to end. And one copy even ends with the proud signature of the scribe who carved it, a man who dated his own work, so we are not guessing at the age. We are reading a dated document written by a named human being, almost 4,000 years ago. But the flood was not the strangest thing on that clay. The strangest thing was what it said human beings were for, because this was never a poem about a garden. It was a story about a labor problem. It was a story about who was going to do the work. Because here's the thing that the garden version never tells you. Before there were any humans at all, somebody still had to do the work. And in this older story, that somebody was the gods themselves. Listen to how it begins, because the very first lines are stunning. When the gods were still men, it says. When the gods were still the ones who carried the load. In the beginning, before a single person walked the earth, there were two kinds of gods. There were the great gods, the senior ones, the ones who sat on thrones and gave the orders, the ones later generations would call the Anunnaki. And then there were the lesser gods, the younger working class of heaven, and these were called the Igigi. And the Igigi were the ones who actually did everything. They were the labor force of the cosmos. And what was the work? It was not gentle. The lesser gods were the ones who had to dig out the beds of the rivers. They were the ones who hauled the earth in baskets to pile up the mountains. They were the ones who dug the great canals that fed the land, the Tigris and the Euphrates, carving the channels by hand. For 3,600 long years, the text says, they carried that basket. Day and night they hauled the dirt and dredged the mud and broke their backs so that the senior gods could rest. And slowly, over those centuries of forced labor, something started to build inside the working gods. Not exhaustion, something hotter than exhaustion. Resentment, the kind of resentment that does not stay quiet forever. And one night it broke. The lesser gods looked at the baskets and the canals and the endless mud, and they decided they were done. And what they did next is one of the most astonishing scenes in all of ancient literature, because it is not a flood and it is not a war. It is a strike. The working gods set fire to their own tools. They burned the baskets and the digging spades in the dark, and then, as a mob, they marched on the house of the chief god Enlil, the great overseer, and they surrounded his temple in the middle of the night, and they raised an uproar at his gate. The boss woke up to find his entire workforce at his door with torches, refusing to lift another load. Heaven had its first labor revolt, and the gods who ran the universe suddenly had no one left to do the digging. Now picture the panic at the top. The senior gods hold an emergency council. Enlil is furious and frightened. Somebody has to do the work, and the workers will not do it anymore. And you cannot run a cosmos where the rivers silt up and the canals collapse and nobody hauls the earth. They argue, they threaten, and then the wisest of them all speaks up, the god of the deep waters and of clever ideas, the one the Babylonians called Ea and the Sumerians called Enki, the same god who turns up again and again in these stories as the one with the plan. And Enki says something that changes everything. He says, do not punish the workers. Make a replacement. Make a new creature to carry the basket. Make a substitute who will take the labor onto its own shoulders so the gods, all of them, the bosses and the workers alike, can finally be free. And that new creature, that purpose-built replacement, that thing designed from the very first breath to carry someone else's load is you. That is the part that should make the hair on your arms stand up. In the oldest version of the story, humanity is not the crown of creation, and it is not the beloved gardener. Humanity is the solution to a staffing crisis. We were invented to do the chores the gods refuse to keep doing, and the recipe they use to invent us is where this stops being merely strange and becomes genuinely dark. To build this new worker, they needed 2 ingredients. The first one you already know because the garden version kept it. They needed clay, earth, mud from the same ground the workers had been digging. The mother goddess, the great womb of heaven, the one called Mami or Nintu, the lady who shapes life. She takes the clay in her hands. So far, this could almost be Genesis. Dust of the ground, clay in the potter's hands. But then comes the second ingredient, and the second ingredient is the one they buried. They needed a god, not the help of a god, the body of one. The council decides that one of the gods must be slaughtered so that the new creature can be mixed from his flesh and his blood, and they choose one. The text names him. He is a god who possessed something the others called intelligence, a god who had a mind, a beating awareness, a personhood, and they kill him. They take his blood, and they take his flesh, and the mother goddess mixes them into the clay, and she kneads the 3 things together, the earth and the divine blood and the divine flesh, until they become one substance. And out of that mixture she pinches off 14 pieces, 7 and 7, and from them she forms the first human beings. You are clay, you are the dirt of the riverbank, but there is a dead god mixed all the way through you, and you cannot ever be separated from him, because he was kneaded into the clay before you were ever shaped, and they hid something inside the name of the god they killed. He was a god with a mind, a god of intelligence, and in the tablet's own language, his name, the word for the new human creature and the word for the ghost left inside it all sound almost like one and the same word. They wired it together so that you cannot say what you are without sounding out the name of the god who died to make you. None of it was an accident. The very intelligence in you, the thing that lets you sit here right now and follow this strange old story, came out of the mind of a god who had to be killed so that you could have it. And the tablet says something about that dead god that I genuinely cannot get out of my head. It says that from the flesh of the slain god, a spirit came to be inside the new creature. The Babylonians had a word for it. They called it the etemu, the ghost, the part of a person that is not the body. And the story gives this ghost a job. It says the ghost exists so that the dead god will never be forgotten, so that there is a living sign beating away inside every single human being that remembers the one who was killed to make us. Some scholars have read the lines to mean that the very drumbeat in your chest, the pulse you can feel right now in your wrist, was meant to be the echo of that slain god, a drum that keeps time so that the dead one is remembered in the living. Whether or not that reading is exact, the core claim of the tablet is unmistakable. There is something divine inside you, and it got there through a death. You are a haunted creature by design. You carry a ghost that was put there on purpose. So let us be very clear about what this oldest story is actually saying about your purpose, because purpose is the whole point of the title that brought you here. You were not built to rule. You were not built to rest. You were built to take the basket off the shoulders of the gods and to carry it yourself. The moment the first humans were finished, the work was handed straight to them. The digging of the canals, the hauling of the earth, the feeding of the temples, the endless maintenance of a world that somebody has to keep running. That became the human job description on day one. In this story, labor is not a punishment that came later because somebody ate a piece of fruit. Labor is the reason you exist in the first place. You were the answer to the question, who is going to do all this work? And the answer was, build something that has to. Try to actually see it for a moment. The mother goddess goddess opens her hands and the clay stirs, and the first human beings sit up out of the mud of the riverbank, blinking, brand new, still wet from the making. And there is no welcome. There is no garden gate and no tree of life and no voice telling them that they are loved. There is a basket already waiting on the ground beside them, and a canal that needs deepening, and a god standing over them pointing at the work that has to be done. That is the first thing the first people ever saw, in the oldest version of the story. Not a paradise, a task. They were awake for only a heartbeat before the weight was already in their arms. And do not imagine the work was only ever about rivers and dirt, because the deepest layer of this is sharper still. Here's the part that should land in your stomach. You were not built to be looked after. You were built to do the looking after, and not for a season, but forever. In the oldest cities on earth, the gods were believed to live inside the great temples, and the gods had to be fed. Every single day, real bread and meat and drink were carried up to the divine images, in the morning and again in the evening, like meals laid before a king who never stops being hungry. The priests believed the gods genuinely depended on it to survive. So when the tablet says humanity was built to carry the labor of the gods, it does not only mean digging ditches. It means the entire reason the human race existed, in the oldest theology there is, was to keep the gods fed and housed and waited upon without end. The whole of early civilization, the temples and the offerings and the endless daily service, was understood as humanity quietly working off the debt it was created to carry. That is a staggering thing to believe about your own existence, and millions of people believed exactly that for thousands of years. And if you think one strange tablet could be a fluke, the kind of thing a single odd scribe might have dreamed up on a long night, here is why it is not. This is not one lonely tablet sitting by itself in the dark, because there is a second great Babylonian text, even more famous than the first, called the Enuma Elish, the long epic that the priests of Babylon recited every new year. And buried in its sixth tablet is the creation of mankind told all over again, with the same shocking core. In that version, the hero god Marduk has just won a cosmic war. He has defeated the great dragon of the Salt Sea, the Chaos Goddess, and he wants to build something to free the gods from labor. And once again, it is clever Enki, called Ea here, who supplies the method. They find the god who started the whole rebellion, the rebel commander who had led the Chaos Army, a god whose name was Kingu. They put the guilt on him. They bind him and they cut him, and they let his blood run. And from the blood of that one rebel god they fashion humankind. And the text states the purpose without a shred of poetry or comfort. Mankind is created to be burdened with the toil of the gods, so that the gods may be at ease. Two different epics, two different cities, two different centuries, and the same blunt verdict. You were made from the blood of a killed god to carry a load that someone else got tired of carrying. And these two Babylonian epics are not even where the trail ends. The Babylonians did not invent this either. They were retelling something the Sumerians, the people who came before them, had already been telling for centuries in an even older language. There is a Sumerian poem in which the same clever god of the deep waters and the same mother goddess pinch the first humans out of clay taken from the top of the watery abyss, so that these new creatures can take over the toil of the gods. And in one strange and very human scene, the two of them get drunk on beer and turn the whole thing into a contest, daring each other to shape broken bodies and find a use for them. One creature they made could not hold back its water. Another was a woman who could never give birth. Another had no sex at all. And for each broken one, the clever god had to invent a place in the world, a role, a job, because even the flawed ones were made to work. The bones of it are identical to everything that came after: clay, the gods, and a creature built to labor. This idea, that humanity is a manufactured workforce molded out of mud, is not some late or fringe notion. It is one of the deepest and oldest currents in the entire river of human memory, and it runs directly underneath the book of Genesis. Now this is the moment where I have to be completely honest with you, because this channel does not survive on lies, and I am not going to insult you with one. I cannot prove to you that the people who wrote the book of Genesis were sitting there with this exact Babylonian tablet open in front of them, copying it line by line. That is a real debate among serious scholars, and anyone who tells you it is a settled fact is selling you something. What we can say, and what is not in dispute, is this: these Mesopotamian stories are demonstrably older than the Hebrew text of Genesis. They come from the same corner of the ancient world, the very region the book of Genesis itself says Abraham walked out of, the land of the two rivers. They use the very same raw materials to make a human being, clay from the ground and a spark of the divine breathed or bled into it, and they answer the exact same question. The difference The thing that should keep you up tonight is not the ingredients. The ingredients are almost identical. The difference is the purpose. One tradition says the divine spark was given to you out of love, so that you could rule a garden in the image of the one who made you. The older tradition says the divine spark was put into you through a murder, so that you could pick up a basket the gods threw down. Same clay, same spark, opposite answer to the question of why. And before anyone rushes down to the comments to correct me, yes, I know that even in the garden there was a job. The book of Genesis itself says that the first man was placed in the garden to work it and to keep it. So labor is not completely absent from the gentle version either. But feel the difference in the weight of it. In the garden, the work is care. It is tending something that is already good, like a keeper among the roses, with the divine walking beside you in the cool of the evening. In the older tablet, the work is the entire reason for your existence. Dropped into your arms the instant you draw your first breath, with no garden and no evening walk, only the basket and the canal and the temple that must be fed. The same act, labor, sits at the dead center of both stories, but in one of them it is a gift you are trusted with, and in the other it is a debt you were minted to pay. That is the whole distance between Eden and the work site, and it fits inside a single word, purpose. And that is what the title means when it says it was not Eden. Look at the world these older humans were built into. There is no garden in the Atrahasis. There is no fruit and no rest and no voice that calls you beloved. There is a work site. The first humans open their eyes onto canals that need dredging and fields that need flooding and temples that need feeding. And they get to it because that is what they were shaped to do. The story does not even pretend it was a paradise. It is honest about being a workforce from the first line to the last. And the cruelest twist of all is what happens next. The part we are going to have to come back to another day, because once the humans were built and the work was finally getting done, they did exactly what living things do. They multiplied, they grew loud, they filled the earth with their numbers and their noise. And up in heaven, the chief god Enlil, the same overseer who had been woken by the strike, found that he could no longer sleep through the racket of his own creation, and he began to think about how to thin the herd. But the flood is a story for another night. So what about that word in the title? They changed it. Who is they? And here I am going to stay honest with you again, because it would be easy and cheap to point a finger at some villain and tell you a secret cabal scrubbed the truth. The more careful answer is more unsettling than a conspiracy. What happened is what always happens to an uncomfortable memory. The harsher, older version, the one where you are a haunted tool made from a dead god to do the god's chores, is not a flattering thing to tell your children. The gentler version, the one where you are the cherished image bearer placed lovingly in a garden, is the one a people would naturally carry forward and polish and keep. The blood in the basket got quietly left behind in the older language on the older clay, and the garden got remembered. The tablet did not get destroyed, it got buried. And buried is not the same as gone, because nearly 4,000 years later a man with a brush and a magnifying glass dug it back out of the ruins and read it again, and now you know what it says. And once you know, you cannot unknow it, because it changes the way you feel the quiet thing in your own chest. The oldest story we have ever recovered does not say you are an accident, and it does not say you are merely an animal. It says something stranger and heavier than either. It says you are a deliberate construction, part river mud and part murdered god, with a ghost installed in you on purpose, built to carry a weight that beings far older than you decided they were finished carrying. It says the divine in you is real, and it got there through a death, and the proof of it is the drum that has not stopped beating since the day you were born. That is not Eden. That was never Eden. And the people who first wrote it down were not trying to comfort you. They were trying to explain why being alive feels so often like work. If that landed somewhere real in you, then do this one thing for me. Write the name Kingu in the comments. Kingu, the rebel god whose blood the oldest tablets say was mixed into the clay to make the first of us. Write it so I know you made it to the end, and so the next person scrolling sees that this story is older and stranger than the one they were handed. Subscribe to the Buried Tablet, because every week we dig another buried answer back out of the ground and read it to you exactly as it was written, before anyone smoothed it over. And the next time someone tells you that you were simply made in a garden, you will remember that there is a slab of clay nearly 4,000 years old that looked at the same human being and saw something the garden left out. You were not born for Eden. According to the oldest story we have, you were built. And next time, I am going to show you what the gods decided to do when the thing they built grew too loud to ignore.